It's later than we think, so I'm not sure it was up to me to call this back together, but I will do so. I know there are people with questions. Before I take questions, I was handed an express mail package in the intermission. Robin Sylvan, who some of you may know as the former director of the Ojai Foundation, is now running something called the Fairhaven Mysteries Project in Bellingham, Washington. And Kat and I have agreed with him to do a 9-day pilgrimage in Hawaii this coming January at the Botanical Garden site there. And it's been named Volcano Orchid Mind. So if any of you, I don't have enough of these flyers for everyone to get one, but if any of you think you might wish to and can afford to spend 9 days with us in Hawaii next January, I'll just leave these out for interested parties. And if there aren't enough to go around, why share at least the informational contact with other people. Okay. Is there anybody burning to ask a question? Yes.
Terence, what are your views on some non-botanicals such as MDMA and ketamine, which are currently...
Well, I think I implied in the talk, I really as the longer I deal with this problem, the more strongly I feel about it. It began as a sort of a very gentle separating, and it's become more and more clear to me that, and I guess I rely on Rupert Sheldrake to give me a basis for saying this, drugs which come out of the laboratory have no history. They do not vibrate with millennia of usage or with being products of the natural environment. They are, as I implied in my lecture, somewhat onanistic. So I view them as drugs. And drugs do different things. Some drugs stimulate you, some depress you, some may even cause the release of personalistic content or repressed traumatic material. Drugs are for people who are ill, is basically my approach to it, while botanical hallucinogens are for extremely healthy people who want to go deeper into experience. I've tried the drugs that you mention. I've certainly found them interesting, but I could not imagine building a career around communicating with people about them. To my mind, what's interesting about them is the contrast with the informational depth of natural hallucinogens. I think the word drug applied across the board to MDMA, ketamine, and psilocybin, mescaline, and those kinds of things does great injustice to the natural compounds. There really should be a linguistic distinction made. So I try to speak of organic substances, or more specifically plants. I don't deny the worth or the efficacy of these laboratory compounds, but they are not planetarily evolved pheromones carrying the messages of Gaia. They are humanly constructed nanotechnological machines useful for intervening in the personalistic dynamics of the psyche. Emmett.
What do you know? Who did you call?
Emmett.
Okay. What do you know about AIDS as a germ warfare?
AIDS as a germ warfare. Well, I don't know anything. I certainly have noticed that within 10 years of the discovery of retroviruses, which the AIDS virus is, you know, one of the dogmas of molecular biology was that there was never transcription from RNA to DNA. It was always from DNA to RNA. Then they discovered the so-called family of retroviruses. Within a very few years, 3 or something after that, AIDS appeared with its curious political selectivity. I mean, this is a drug which goes after homosexuals, people who shoot intravenous drugs, black people, and loose people. If they could have just somehow gotten the Tay-Sachs thing in there too, so it would have gotten Jews, I'm sure they would have really been pleased with themselves. If it is, in fact, a piece of political engineering, I don't know that it is, but I certainly notice its curious selectivity. If it is, you may be sure that this is a secret buried far deeper than anything having to do with Auschwitz or Watergate or anything else. You want to talk about a crime against humanity. This is a crime against humanity on a previously inconceivable scale. There's been a lot of speculation about this. Granted, some of it has emerged from East Bloc countries, but on the other hand, it's well documented that other bacteriological and chemical agents were tested in this very city in the 50s and 60s. Some of you may know the incidents that I'm referring to. So it's a possibility not to be ruled out, certainly. I said that you would be next, yeah.
You talked about the psychedelic experience and the mushroom, in contrast to, but similar to, and also a mystical state or achieving enlightenment through other means not drugs. My understanding somewhat has been that the use of yoga or meditation or whatever to achieve these states would produce ultimately some kind of a permanent state of mind that would alter one's consciousness, if it is indeed able to be achieved that way, that would alter one's consciousness 24 hours a day. With drugs, your suggestion is there's an easier way to learn similar things about this state of being or whatever through drugs.
Through plants, really.
Through plants, but I know that you take a drug and you have experiences and certain kinds of realizations, and then you come down. So do you feel that there's some kind of program for ingesting the mushroom, or would it become something that would become part of your diet, or do you reach a state where you do indeed achieve sort of a permanent symbiosis?
Well, I think that your point is well taken. Nevertheless, the mushrooms, the psilocybin, affects the imagination. It is a stimulant to the imagination. And I don't really think that that is dissipated, or if it is dissipated, it's very slowly. Also, I'm not entirely convinced of the claim of the yogic schools that they can lock in these extraordinary states permanently. It seems to me that the shamans that I have had acquaintance with certainly are not abusers of these substances. On the other hand, they are regular users. And I think that it's fine that the insights are tested against the momentum of down reality. Yoga, most schools of yoga, in fact, I believe all schools of yoga, can be traced back to the 2nd century, the Yogic Sutras of Patanjali. Well, Patanjali explicitly states that light-filled herbs, his phrase, light-filled herbs, are one of the legitimate paths to achieving these high states. Certainly, if you look at the Rig Vedas are a vast and enthusiastic paean of praise to something called Soma, which was greater than Indra, greater than the gods of the old Vedic pantheon, the central mystery of the Vedic civilization. Gordon Wasson has argued very persuasively that it was a mushroom of some sort. So I really believe that if we had a completely clear picture of the evolution of Indian culture, we would see that for some reason, open at this point in history and looking back at it only to speculation, an institution of botanical shamanism was transformed into the notion of a lineage and a secret teaching and a set of physiological practices. So the issue of permanence is a kind of an odd one. Obviously, once you are not always stoned if you take a hallucinogen, a plant hallucinogen, but I am living proof that you're never the same. So somewhere between always stoned and never be the same is where one falls. Yes?
This grasp of the verbal language? Is that one of your changes?
Well,
what were you like in high school?
Different questions. No. I've thought about this a good deal because people keep bringing it up, and I find myself saying, that it synergizes command of language and so forth and so on. But the most honest answer I can give you is I was always glib. And in high school, we had a big forensics scene going in my high school. Well, you had two choices. You could be in debate or extemp. And I said, so what is debate? And they said, well, you stay after school and you make 3x5 cards on resolved that the General Association of Trades and Tariffs should admit the United States as a member. And I said, okay, so what is extemp? And they said, you go in cold and you draw 3 topics out of a hat, and you have 3 minutes to choose one of them and prepare a 15-minute talk. And I said, I'll go with that. And I was very, very good at it. But as I grew up and went to Asia and wandered around as a freak, basically, I had no sense of myself as having great verbal facility. I discovered that really on the mushrooms. And if any of you, there's a book I can recommend that is excellent reading on the subjects we've been talking about. It's edited by Michael Harner, although he does not make a contribution other than to edit it. It's called Hallucinogens and Shamanism, and it contains about 9 articles on various plants with shamanic usage. Henry Munn, who is an anthropologist who has spent a lot of time in the Oaxacan highlands, has an article in there called The Mushrooms of Language. And he says, they catalyze language, they catalyze verbal facility. And we don't know what the basis of the well-documented traditions of oral poetizing that we find when we go back into the Western tradition. It still exists in rural Yugoslavia. We don't know what the factors were that created that. I think that most people who take plant hallucinogens are simply inspired to attempt to clean up their communication skills, because you do wish to communicate it. And it's the stereotyped view of the intoxicated mystic in our society is of an idiot, the inarticulate hippie, the guy who just says, well, man, it's like, In my experience, that is not what it is at all. They are an extremely potent catalyst for communication. Yes, the blonde woman in the back, and then...
Do you think it's possible through artificially created hallucinogenics to program someone, even if maybe just from one really good trip, to program them perhaps to change in their whole outlook on life? I get the idea with what you're speaking of with natural substances, you're bringing out something that's already in you or allowing some consciousness that perhaps is intact. I'm speaking about introducing perhaps some foreign consciousness into your mind through chemically altered something.
Do you mean as in a control or in a psychoanalytic sense, like curing an addiction or an obsession?
No, I'm talking about like having been given acid at one point, and I mean, even many years later, still sometimes having like flashbacks on it and wondering what perhaps might have been in that drug or what it did to you.
Well, I think that the most complex phenomenon in our world is the human psyche. And one does occasionally meet people who are horrified by my position and say, I took LSD 25 years ago and it's taken me this long to get it back together, and even now I don't feel that together. To me, the psychedelic is responsible only in the sense that it gave an X-ray of the psyche to the ego. And people who have been severely traumatized or abused or molested as children, who have real problems, are going to discover the breadth and depth of this traumatic material, and it may inhibit their ability to set themselves free and become great psychedelic explorers. I don't advocate this for everyone. In fact, I counsel people, and I don't always tell people they should go ahead with their plans if they're contemplating a psychedelic experience. Sometimes I tell them they need to do more reading or have more therapy, and sometimes I tell them they shouldn't do it at all. It's a calling. Shamanism is a calling, and in traditional societies, shamans pick and choose very carefully who they will take on as apprentices. So it's by no means a given that everyone is going to find these things to their taste. On the other hand, those who do find it to their taste will inculcate it into their lives very readily, and it will become very important to them, their self-definition, and their psychic growth. To address possibly another aspect of your question, is it possible to program people with these drugs, or a combination of these drugs and hypnosis and that sort of thing? I have no doubt that it is. The little bit that we see, that we are able to get declassified from CIA experiments in the 60s, is hair-raising. I mean, they dreamed of people who would commit acts of violence or assassination and then completely forget that they had done it. Now, how far down the road with these kinds of programs they got, we don't know to this day. I am very careful about who and what I am around in a state of psychedelic awareness, because you do imprint these things, and that's why, in the same way that the shaman chooses his apprentice very carefully, the apprentice should be very aware of choosing the teacher very carefully. You, sir.
Yeah, I've had some major experiences with LSD in terms of ego death and just a complete crushing of my psyche and what I my point of view, and then have come through into some brilliant light and really a very spiritual experience. And I'm only now starting to play with the mushrooms for more of that experience. And I wonder if you could relate if the mushrooms have the potential to have that painful aspect of the crushing and the ego death kind of experience. So far, I haven't had that kind of experience with the mushrooms.
Well, a very nice thing about the mushroom is that it's extremely tolerant of beginners. Nevertheless, downstream from those early experiences, you're dealing with, call it the overmind, the superego. It will give you not what you want, but what you need. And it can be extremely painful. It can be extremely humbling. It can be terrifying. It seems to me, in the people I have known and in looking at my own trips that had that quality to them, it's always to the good. The ego is completely obsessed with control and wants everything to be ameliorated and presented in easily digestible increments and to proceed along an orderly program of unfoldment. And it isn't like that. It has its own weather, it has its own dynamics, and you're much more in the position of someone sailing alone in a small sailboat. You can check the weather very carefully, and this will give you an edge. Nevertheless, squalls can turn into great storms with astonishing rapidity, and yet then you're in a position to really learn. But the learning is not, the real intense learning is not necessarily painless. And I see people nodding their heads all over the room. It is not for the faint-hearted. It just simply is not for the faint-hearted. People talk about how there are no frontiers left, and we lead such coddled lives within this society and in our well-furnished apartments with our stacks of CDs and all this. Actually, it isn't true. You can turn your living room into the helm of Magellan's ship. It's simply that the great unexplored dimensions are internal and psychological, but no less dangerous for that. So it's a calling for the exploring spirit, someone who really wants that thrill. Yes?
Yes, if I understood you correctly, I thought you were saying that history is always profane. And I wonder if that's true, because I'm thinking of, say, the prophetic tradition, the idea of that there's a meaning in history, that there's social injustice. I'm thinking of someone like Martin Luther King, for instance, who sort of comes out of that tradition. Did I understand you correctly on that?
Not exactly. This is a distinction that Merciliade made in a book which was very important to me called The Myth of the Eternal Return, Cosmos and History, Myth of the Eternal Return. If you haven't read it, read it. It's a great book. And he simply set up these two terms, sacred and profane. And what he means is that sacred space is paradigmatic space. That means that it is ritualistic space. It is always involved with the repetition of an archetypal activity. He uses the Latin phrase in ilio tempore, which literally in English simply means in that time. But what it really refers to is the time before history. So the juxtaposition of sacred and profane is not a value judgment. It's simply a way of talking about two kinds of time. One that is cyclical and engaged in the ritual establishment of a kind of archetypal space, and the other that is linear and rational and proceeds from a beginning toward a future. No, obviously, history is studded with examples of great saintliness, great insight, great displays of compassion and understanding. So I didn't mean to imply that, and hope that I didn't. Yes?
Earlier, you made an excellent delineation between laboratory-produced drugs and botanicals. The question is, are the effects of each of these two different on the subtle bodies of people?
Well, something more that I could have said about that, a very practical argument for botanical drugs, especially ones with a history of shamanic usage, is simply that they have a history of human usage. That's where the market testing was done over thousands and thousands of years. If a compound is toxic or triggers psychosis or mutagenic or induces tumors, it will have been dropped long ago by human groups who experiment with these things. Something can come out of the laboratory and be psychoactive, elicit some change in the self-perception of psyche, and can have all kinds of unknown or potential side effects. So what I always say to people, if I can reconstruct it here, who ask this kind of a question is, there are 3 tests to apply to a compound that you're thinking of ingesting. First of all, does it have a history of shamanic usage? Does it come from plants? Plants are also biological systems like us. They cannot produce truly alien compounds. And thirdly, does it have a relationship to known human brain chemistry? And I usually say to people, if you get 2 out of 3 on this test, it's probably okay to go ahead. But if it fails 2 of the 3 or 3 of the 3, I would steer wide of it. A perfect example, I mean, I don't want to dump on anybody's favorite drug, but just because I'm familiar with the literature, let me give an example. Ketamine. Ketamine is a fascinating experience. I had a lot of psychedelic experience under my belt before I came to ketamine, and I was amazed at what it does to psyche. However, there's a significant amount of literature which indicates that it can cause epileptic kindling. There is another significant body of literature which indicates that it depresses the immune system to such a degree that it has now been dropped from general surgery. It's even, I understand, being dropped from veterinary use because all these vets were reporting that a very large percentage of cat patients were not recovering from quite straightforward operations, being spayed and that sort of thing. And ketamine begins to look like the culprit in that. Well, now, if it didn't have that bad rap, I would be willing to grant that it was a very interesting compound. But I just, my immune system is very precious to me, and also I find the notion of epileptic kindling to make me very uncomfortable. So, in spite of the fact that the experience is quite interesting, I would go very slow with that. I certainly wouldn't settle into it as a lifestyle. So just to reiterate, does it come from a plant? That means that it is benign to life. Does it have a history of shamanic usage? That means that it is benign to human populations. And then this third thing, does it have an affinity with brain chemistry? Because, you see, the brain views a drug as an insult to it. The brain has what is called the blood-brain barrier, and then behind that many enzymatic mechanisms for degrading any foreign substance and turning it into harmless substrates. The perfect case example would be dimethyltryptamine. Dimethyltryptamine is, without contest, the most powerful hallucinogen known to me. And I've spent a while looking into the matter. Okay, it does occur in plants. It does have a history of human usage in the Amazon basin. But what is most astonishing about it is when you smoke it, within 7 to 12 minutes, you completely return to normal. Now, what is happening there is that the DMT is crossing the blood-brain barrier very rapidly, giving you a phenomenal psychedelic experience, and enzyme systems are locking on to these molecules and saying, I know what this is. I know how to deanimate, dealkylate this compound and quickly turn it into indole acetic acid, which is a common excretory pathway for these kinds of compounds in the brain. So the speed with which DMT clears the human brain and returns you to normal is a very, very strong argument for its harmlessness. So if you take a drug and the next day you feel lousy and the next day you sort of feel okay, that's not a very good drug. That's an insult to the physical brain and should not be done because, we're in this for the duration. This is a task of a lifetime. So you want compounds which are extremely effective in delivering the noetic experience, the plunge into the tremendum, but you also want to be able to race again another day. And that involves paying attention to these other factors. People who are contemplating this as an experiment or a lifestyle, this dealing with psychedelics as a growth program, the first thing I say to people is make a trip to the library. A great deal is known about these things. Read the physiological literature, read the ethnographic literature, and assimilate that data so that you're not just going into it blind. Take a little responsibility for what you're doing. I'm appalled at people who take 8 different kinds of drugs in an evening and tell me they have astonishing experiences. I'll bet they do. But that's not for the duration. You can't build a lifestyle on that kind of thing. What you want to do is have access into the dimension in a way that is clean and informed and ethical and intelligent. That's how these shamans in the Amazon do it. I was tremendously impressed by their authenticity and by their awareness of these issues. These people are not naive, as so much of the ethnographic literature insists. They are extremely sophisticated. Obviously, in these matters, more sophisticated than we are. We have much to learn from them. That's why visionary and ecstatic shamanism is the model for doing this kind of exploratory work. Sir?
Okay, I got a question which was crucial to me, and I think everyone. The long version is you espouse 2 different positions, well, many, but these particular 2. The first one acknowledges that it's possible to transform yourself or investigate your world in a different way, and thereby save the planet. So you were saying at one point that even though, individually, in the face of insurmountable odds, it's possible to actually do that. You seem to be quite optimistic about that. There's obviously within your realm of possibility. That's involved with shamanism work and so forth. Now, on the other hand, obviously, a lot of people are aware there's a whole body of end-time scripts coming from shamans, from Indian tribes. I mean, going back to Nostradamus, there isn't, to my knowledge, I may be going wrong, but there exists this overwhelming body of prophecy, which is a lot of which was produced on each sort of psychedelic drugs. How do you reconcile those two positions, or with some sense of hope? I mean, how do you reconcile having free will to change them or to save it? On the other hand, up against this monolithic block of information which says we're going to come up against this stuff very soon. The short question is, how do you avoid getting the horrors when you trip into the modern world?
Okay, what about these, as you so aptly put it, these end-time scripts? The only one which is truly pessimistic is the fundamentalist interpretation of the Judeo-Christian appetite for apocalypse. That is a lethal script for the planet in which only 144,000 are saved. I agree and participate in the generation of these end-time scripts, but what I always say is it's an ontological transformation of categories, not the toxification or explosion of the planet. That is a unique point of view claimed by these Christian groups. And I think to the degree that they do that, they place a heavy burden on the rest of us. It's bad enough that we have these nuclear arsenals and the capacity to destroy ourselves without having an explicitly stated death wish as a cultural ideal. So I will... it's a question of apocalypse or millennium. And I believe that it will be a millenarian unfolding beyond the end time, not a cessation of life and a general judgment and a consigning of 99.99% of us to eternal damnation. How do you avoid getting the willies? A lot of people do get the willies when they are tripping and they come up against this end-time stuff. I think that the only cure is to stick with it. I always think of Frank Herbert's excellent advice that he puts into the mouth of his character Muad'Dib in Dune. He says, when the fear comes, it comes like a great wind. And what you do is you simply clamp down and wait, and it will blow itself out. One of the first things a psychedelic voyager must learn to do is to discipline the hind brain. The hind brain is a creature of fight or flight, and you must just turn to that and say, now see here. We are neither going to fight nor fly from this. We are simply going to freeze and watch, and the fear builds up. It's a chemical thing, and it builds up, and then those same systems that destroy the DMT, that deanimate and dealkylate it, will take the fear apart before your very eyes and leave you in peace. So we are in a great temporal vortex. This is not the subject of tonight's lecture, but it is the subject of much of my thinking. The fact that we are being funneled toward a kind of ultimate historical crisis. To the degree that you have bought in to the assumptions and values and aspirations of historical society, it's going to look to you like the world is just flying to pieces. To make it make sense, we have to decondition ourselves from those values and those assumptions and realize that we are embedded in the body of Gaia. The creode along which the development of life on this planet is being propelled has walls which are extremely steep and high. There is very little possibility of us jumping out of that groove and creating a kind of apocalypse for ourselves and the planet, because we are not in this matter free agents. This matter of whether or not the planet shall be destroyed is something which the overmind or the superego of the species reserves unto itself. The proof of that in the present historical moment has got to be that a bloodthirsty nudnik like Ronald Reagan will sign an IMF agreement. If it is in the interests of people like that to support disarmament and disengagement and rethinking of the lethal momentum of history, then how much more it will be a part of the program of those who will eventually replace these people. We have reached the point, I think, where ideology has given way to a perhaps even more base desire, the desire to make a buck. And it is bad business to have thermonuclear wars. Therefore, the hysterical war hawks of capitalism, or of not even capitalism, but this fundamentalist, self-righteous, demagogic democracy, and of Marxist, millenarian, save-the-world types, has been completely read out of the picture. Governments are growing more and more irrelevant, while banking, commerce, and investment are beginning to dictate terms to these institutions. It is bad business to blow up the world, and this is the great salvation of all of us, even though we may not be particularly keen on the business ethic or mentality. So I'm very optimistic. I think great changes will be seen in our lifetime, and I think the lethal mythologies are being overthrown very, very subtly by the superego, by placing goals that even the dullest of us will turn to in preference to waging a thermonuclear war. Anyone else? Yes.
Just interested a little bit in the vision you have for a post-historical relationship between the people and the technology that they create, which we sometimes go crazy with. It builds us the glasses and the other good things that improve our...
Well, I think that culture is a dimension, literally, and that for 10 or 15,000 years, it has been a very low dimension. In other words, if you think of it as a dimension orthogonal to nature, it has been just a slight adumbration of nature. But now we are taking unto ourselves, through human-machine interfacing and nanotechnology and this kind of thing, this dimensionality of culture is becoming rather more expanded. So my notion of a post-historical world is a world where all of the technological appurtenances of the present world have been shrunk to the point where they have disappeared into and are scattered as grains of sand along the beaches of this planet. And we all live naked in paradise, but only a thought away is all the cybernetic connectedness and ability to deliver manufactured goods and data that this world possesses. So really, when I see the historical process running off the scale, it is not that we are destroyed at the end of it. It's simply that it runs off the scale into another dimension. Culture is where we are all going to live, but culture need not be something which is toxic to nature. It need not come tangential to nature at all. It can be in an entirely different dimension. This is why I often talk about what I call living in the imagination. The imagination, which begins as a slight, almost a flicker of iridescence across the mental world of ordinary reality, is going to grow and self-reinforce and expand until it will be virtually all there is, if that's all one chooses to experience. Now, a person living in, let's say, Midtown Manhattan, they live in a dimension where nature has been entirely read out. The problem is it has been literally read out. It has been bulldozed into non-existence. What we need to create is the equivalent of Midtown Manhattan, but in a dimension such that it nowhere comes tangential to the body of the planet, either by scenario 1, the engineering scenario, by placing it in outer space, or scenario 2, the postmodern engineering scenario, putting it into nanotechnology, or scenario 3, the psychedelic engineering scenario, where we somehow put it into mind, whatever that is. So the post-historical world is the world where thought defines the modalities of being rather than the laws of physics and inertia. If wishes were horses, beggars would ride. Well, eventually, I think wishes will be horses and beggars will ride, but not across the surface of this planet, but through and across the endless grasslands of the imagination. One or two more, yes.
Is there anything to be said for MDMA because of its friendly nature, just as a means of turning on large numbers of squares?
Yes, I think in my lecture I said that drugs are for sick people. Anybody who doesn't love their neighbor needs chemical or therapeutic intervention. And, if MDMA in the hands of a skillful therapist can do that, more power to it. But it addresses sort of trimming the fingernails of the ego, not these dimensions that I am talking about. Someone else, yes.
An area that you talked about that reminds me of something that I've been very interested in studying when it comes to call it the ecology of history. Can you say something about why a culture that grew up or evolved in the tropics would be so different than one that grew up, like you said, barren land?
Because of the overwhelming presence of ordered organic systems at every level. I mean, if you don't have to grow up in the Amazon. If you're there 3 weeks, you begin to get the message that, my God, this is some kind of a brain. You take a lungful of air, and it's like a symphony of odors, which you know to be pheromones, carrying messages from one member of a species to another, from species to species. So then you shift your sensory focus to sound, and you realize, that languages are going on all around you, hundreds of them, between species, among species. The tropical rainforest is the most exquisitely ordered process on the planet, and any culture which grows up with that as its front yard is going to be a culture immersed in the Tao, inevitably, because you don't survive unless you come to terms with it on its terms. None of your rules count for anything. It sets all the boundary constraints, and you see the exquisite ordering, how it all works, the economy of form, the economy of resource, and the depth of its pure communication. So that's the great difference. You know, Heinrich Zimmer, in his massive study of Indian art, says of the cultures that wrote the Vedas, he says their great breakthrough was they had no cosmic mountains, no sacred rivers, no holy spots. They worshipped fire, and where the sacred fire was kindled, the center of the universe came to be. They could erect this ritual space anywhere. This is, in a sense, a breakthrough in consciousness, but also it's a denial of the power of place, and it gives then permission for greater misuse and disregard of nature to come. And I view those Aryan people not as an Eastern culture, but as the furthest most extension of Western culture. They set us on this path as surely as the Greeks. So the two probably can be traced together somewhere south of the Caspian Sea. One last question.
I've heard you speak before of man's role in the mycological spreading of the mycological network of the mushroom. I'm wondering if you could, if you knew of how this is going in Europe and even beyond there, if home propagations.
Oh yes, home propagation is now a worldwide phenomenon. It was a great change for the mushroom to become no longer an endemic of the grasslands of the tropics, but to become an endemic of the cellars and attics of the industrial democracies, bringing a shamanic ally into the very heart of high-tech culture, which it does very nicely. It teaches cleanliness, punctuality, discretion, all virtues that definitely need to be cultivated. So you see, it is a symbiotic relationship. What the mushroom is giving us is information about the world outside of and beyond history. What we are giving it is an extremely extended range, which is, by definition, one of the things that defines the successful adaptation of a species. So it isn't all going one way. It is not a parasitism by one upon the other, but definitely a real symbiosis. I'm sure many of you are aware that in the Amazon, one of the major life forms that quickly thrusts itself upon your attention in any tropical forest are the leaf-cutting ants. They move in great coordinated streams, and they chop up leaves. They can strip a huge tree in hours. And what they do with these leaves is they take them back to their hive and they chew them up and make a paste out of them and stick them all over the walls of their underground cavities, and then they place spores into this mulch. Not any spore, but spores that they have over the tens of millennia selected. These spores change the inedible cellulose of the leaves into edible sugars, and the ants eat those sugars and thrive. So the symbiotic relationship between social animals and fungi is a very well-established phenomenon of the biome of this planet. And in fact, isn't it interesting that the social insects are the one other area of organic nature where we begin to see similarities with our own style of social organization. They use chemicals to communicate. We use small mouth noises. But if the scenario I laid out for you this evening is correct, both societies were called into being through symbiosis with fungi that were operating in a mutual, a reciprocal relationship of mutual reinforcement and support. So it's a model that has been tried before, and it's generally agreed that these leaf-cutting ants are the most sophisticated of all the social insects. So the mycological mind seems to do this. It can take primates or insects and through the slow passage of the millennia organize them into great self-reflecting societies held together by communication. The breakthrough with us was with a much larger brain, with a much stronger hand. We have then evolved a kind of open-ended symbiotic relationship with the mushroom, while the insect societies have been caught in a closed loop, probably because of the small size of their individual brains and their limited ability to manipulate physical matter. But the principle is the same. The distinguishing difference is that our relationship with the mushroom is open-ended and promises a bright future not only for ourselves and the mushroom, but by implication for all life on the planet. Because as we come to realize the ethics of biology, we will cease to be so xenophobic and homocentric and much more willing to see ourselves as the stewards of the planetary garden. And this is, I think, ultimately what the psychedelic experience and what psychedelic shamanism leads us into: stewardship of the planetary garden in order to create an endlessly self-transcending horizon to all of our futures. Thank you very much.